Hello and welcome to another episode of Music for. And I'm here with Amrita Sen to talk about how music can affect our lives and how the different nuances of music and tonalities can actually make us better, but as well how we can actually improve and keep changing like a good rhythm, like a good song that you keep writing and you keep playing or you keep listening. Rita and me have been doing this right now for some time, and I think we're having a lot of fun. But this is actually a great exercise for people listening to us, and special for me to think about life, to pause, to just breathe, and as well to enjoy. And hopefully, we're going to be talking about a lot of music and continuing as well. One of the topics that is important for us, that is the music for Buddha and the concept of Buddha and the spirituality, but as well all the nuances that come out of that and out of the book of Amrita Sen and her music.
Nice,
Amrita,
nice to see you, Dennis. How are you?
I'm exceptional. Well, with a lot of ups and downs, but always exceptional, especially for this moment.
Yeah. Well, I wrote this book uh, almost 4 years ago, right? I wrote this book because I wanted to take on a challenge of how different fairy tales, and it's kind of an offensive term, but I'll use fairy tale interchangeably with myth, with story, with narrative. So all four of them are kind of the same thing right now. I loved, have always been a fan of the mythology of Buddha. We don't know exactly what happened though. 600 BC, we know a lot of things, but we don't know exactly how he came up with whatever concepts he came up with. But I always had this sneaking suspicion that he was so rich, right? His wife was so rich. His wife was his cousin. They were married for almost 10 years before he left. I had this sneaking suspicion when I was writing the book 4 years ago that she had a lot to do with the whole thing. And she never really got the credit, right? As is probably the case with a lot of kings and emperors and lords of the world throughout history, is that there's probably a few other people attached to the success of the movement or the empire. So I had this theory, working theory, that Yashodhara, Buddha's wife, most likely had a lot to do with his success. So with that thesis, I thought, okay, what if we made her be the owner of the tree, the proverbial famous Bodhi tree? What if we made her the owner of that tree, and then she lost the tree, and then in the pursuit of that loss, Buddha came up with his solution to the suffering of humanity. So that was the premise, and the book is, there, and there's a narration. You guys could all listen to it. Then I thought, there is no way I'm going to write this book without writing a soundtrack for it. It's just not going to happen. If I can't enable myself to write the soundtrack, then I'm just going to not do the book. The other predicament in doing the soundtrack was, and this is something artists go through, to do a soundtrack, to do music nowadays, you really have to know software. Again, another hurdle. You can't just sing it into an iPhone. You can't really just say, here's my melody, here's my lyrics, now go do with it what you will. You have to then have a further development of agency where you can put that music in your head in some sort of digital environment to make the music. So the second challenge for me was to have the infrastructure in my home or the studio, have all the instruments, have all the mixing software, have the knowledge of how to use that software to make that particular artistic work come to life. Luckily, I had already started that process with Cosmic and Eternal Love that I did for Barnes and Noble. With Buddha, we really, I put together a music team, and I feel like we really took it to the next level, sonically and all that kind of stuff. So there exists these 6 or 7 songs. Then I sort of had the music, had the coloring book, and had the illustrations and the story, and I'm like, it didn't feel right. For whatever reason, I think artists go through this a lot. It didn't feel like it was time to release it in the marketplace. So I sort of developed a career in storytelling and producing. And all of a sudden, I would say, Dinis, I met you, and this topic of well-being, of all these topics that hopefully we'll cover some of them today. Well-being, mindfulness, dealing with suffering, concepts of regret, concepts of human agency, of empathy, all these things started to kind of coalesce for me in today's time. And I thought this is really a great time to bring this book back. But now it needs to be slightly updated. So what I've been doing as we have been doing this series is I went back, I narrated the book, and a narration is a totally different process than writing. I would encourage every writer to narrate their own writing with a nice mic. And then I started going back through the music. And I realized that each character in the book has its own theme. Like, for instance, Yoshadara, whose name is Dara in the book, has this theme, which I'll sing it for you, and then we can cut to the actual theme from the album. It's bum ba da dum ba da 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 dum da dum dum da da dum da da dum da 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 da. So the reason I like this theme for Dara is because it does start with something that's melancholy, but underneath it, from a chord structure standpoint, there's something very grand and kind of self-propelling. Bum, ba-da-dum, bum, ba-bum. There's something that actually carries her into another journey. So I liked that basic motif for her, and chord-wise, it allowed us as a musical team to do a lot with it. Similarly, the tree that she loses and Buddha later finds had its own theme. And this theme was much more drawn out, which led into Dara's theme. So I'll sing it for you. It's bum ba da 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 ba da 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 end of the theme, but it actually floats because the tree theme is just ongoing and it just goes on, but it floats and it doesn't get resolved until Dara comes into the picture, or Buddha, which is da 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 da. So basically, it was the first time I was experimenting with a theme that's very elaborate, unresolved in its construction, and then another human's theme comes in to resolve the other character's theme. I'd seen it done in different soundtracks, but this was the first time I kind of put pen to paper and did this. And I really liked the process and I liked the result. So I know I'm rambling a little bit, but that's kind of how the music for the Buddha series took place. Once I had those two themes, my gosh, did it go fast. Fast, fast, fast. Lightning.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much for singing for us. So a couple of questions here, because of course this is it's a very powerful story, and there's been kind of the unity between our series. In terms of the process, the creative process that you put on this, because there's the music, there's the writing, and there's as well all the process of making the unity between all of these. And I'm seeing this always as a film, or as a series, whatever you want here, because it's so special. So how do you, let's go back to the process, the creative process on this, because and of course we've been putting in our series all the links to your Spotify, and I'm sure you're going to be releasing much more things. And as well, what I like to do is, so first of all is the creative process, but as well the research process, because I think that is a very important thing, and because this is so complex topic, because of course first of all is Buddha, is one of the biggest icons in history. And second, of course, is his wife, which was as well a real figure in history. And then, of course, third is all the components of music, spirituality, gender, and an historical moment that affect all the history of humanity, or a huge part of humanity, let's put it that way.
Okay, the creative process, I think I work with a lot of filmmakers, and one of the people I do want to invite here is the creator of Rome, because he's a maybe next series next week. There is a commonality to the creative process, particularly when it involves historical material. Research is your best friend, and research is your best friend who punches you in the face pretty much every day, right? So you're with this thing like as a pal, and it's called research. It's called books, articles, and every day it just is, it behaves very badly to you, but you still have to treat it like it's your best friend. It's yelling at you, it's screaming at you, it is saying, oh, this is irrelevant, this doesn't matter, you're wasting your time, it's sucking up your time. And it is the most painful part of the creation of interpretive historical content. But I don't see a way around it. And when I took on the Buddha project, the research itself took intensely, I would say 8 to 12 months. Lots of books, lots of articles, lots of random books that are almost archival, books about Yoshadara. There was one book I read that somebody had the presence of mind to write about her dying days and just talking about Yoshadara's experience, imagining an experience she might have had in her bed with loved ones coming to visit her. Just book. Now, most people would think that in the construction of what happened with Buddha, that's an irrelevant book. But if you could believe that that was the missing link for me in terms of coming up with the story, what truly was her sense of regret and her pride was the thing that gave me emotion for the story. So what I would say to anybody who's embarking on any story, but mainly historical interpretations, is research is going to be your best friend that you hate and that hates you back. But it'll come, right? So then you have your research, you say, okay, here's my nugget. I got the nugget. And then you essentially, and I have talked to a lot of writers about this too. They start with the nugget of the idea, okay? The idea in the Buddha case was, let's reimagine what might have happened between Buddha and Yoshadara, and let's reimagine what her emotion was at the time he left. Simple idea, right? A lot of friends who are in professional screenwriting have told me that what you do then is do big character sketches. Take 2-3 pages and write out what her childhood was like. What's her character? What does she like to eat? Imagine you're rebuilding a human being, right? You do the character sketch. I ended up doing the character sketch of the king, of Buddha, of Yoshadara. I also did a character sketch of an old man, because in the case of the Buddha mythology, there is an old man figure that is very critical to being the window, the herald, the almost the Obi-Wan Kenobi in terms of how Buddha saw through his lens the poverty out there. He was a very good opening act for Buddha to see, oh my God, look at the vastness of this poverty. So in the book, there was a very strong character sketch of this old man. And in the end, I only had 2 or 3 lines for the old man. You know, I didn't use the material. So once I kind of started having the construction of the book, the arcs, the acts, I would also encourage people to use Final Draft, because Final Draft allows you to lay out each scene in a very sticky note sort of a way. And there's another software called Writer's Duet, which allows you to have these scenes and sticky notes online. Pull it together, get a whiteboard, just take any material, take your house, take regular sticky notes, just go for it and just get the construction of the story down. once I had the construction of the story, again, I realized then after the story was kind of pretty much baked, I realized, okay, Dara is a big character. She needs a theme. And then I realized, okay, the tree's a big character in this, you know, big character with a voice. So let's give him a theme song. Then Buddha, obviously Buddha, and then then other characters evolve, like the palace grounds is a character. So had the theme, you know, up until from research to theme song was a very, very difficult process. Theme song later was an entirely different way of working. And that's less, in a way, that's less relatable because it's very technical. How you take a theme song into, and there's, I'm not an expert. Like there's Hans Zimmer talking about theme song to fully developed score in masterclass. I had my own process, but the story to theme song development, I felt that there was a unique process which I would probably repeat again because it did end up working for me.
It's amazing, and it's a fantastic process that you have there. So I want to ask one thing, because it's during the process of course, you've been working with someone. For people not knowing, and I suggest you listen as well to the other interview, or the first interview I did with you in my podcast series, The Search for Amrita. Amrita has a huge background working with some of the biggest music personalities in the world, from the likes of Timbaland to Justin Timberlake, and as well Christina Aguilera. So I want to, of course, there was in kind of another iteration of your career as an agent, but how do you see that part of, because in the end of the day, as a creator, and this process that we're talking about, which is very spiritual as well, because in the end of the day, you're dealing with a spiritual icon, probably the biggest in history, or one of the top 3 or top 4 biggest in history.
For sure.
How do you deal, especially from your not just the creative side, because that you describe it, but the emotional part of touching that as an artist? And when you look at all the other artists that you work, because this is a very high profile topic, we're not talking about the topic. Normally these kind of topics are for operas or for television series, or for big films, let's put it that way, or more kind of even academic research. But you're dealing that with an album, with pop, and as well with different kind of types of eclectic sounds, which is unique in your music. I want to touch a bit that, because I think that's quite unique as well here.
So your question, if I could paraphrase it, is how do you work with big artists, or how do you construct that?
Yeah, your constructive process around the topic so high profile, and making a parallel with your experience working with other artists, so big personalities.
That's a great question. You know, I want to be thoughtful about answering that, because I don't want to discourage other artists from taking on the journey that I did. But what's unique to my situation is that I came into this world with an extremely potent artistic ability in singing, general melodic content that exists in my brain, and the ability to draw. Okay. So for many years, I was very scattered in how to take these, what you would appear as disparate technical talents, not creative talents, technical talents that I was born with, how to kind of make it something that had meaning for me, had something that where I could say, this is my body of work. Whether it became famous or not is a whole other ball of wax that I really don't have any expertise in. But where I do have, I feel the hours put into it, is how you can tie different art forms and technical things together into something that is a comprehensive work of art. My situation is that while I was doing all this, I had access to and the ability to work with very prominent people. My first experience in working with a very prominent Bollywood, I would say, icon is A.R. Rahman. You know, when I was doing my craft on the side, I was agenting big people. I was working with 50, working with Kanye West, working with Christina Aguilera, a lot of music publishers, but no one really knew that I had music ability. But when AR came to town and the opportunity to audition for the Oscars and to stand in line, basically, and say, I'm a singer, and to audition for the Oscars, when that moment came, it was really the moment I had to grab to say, look, I have technical skill in singing. And then you kind of use that as a platform to get into additional environments where you can test out your technical skill, right? Shortly after AR, I mean, and it was such a rewarding experience because it wasn't just the Oscars. It was Oprah Winfrey. It was his tour in Vegas. It was a lot of different interactions. It was so many other meetings at his house, and just meeting his engineers, meeting other musicians who work with him. So it really carried on to even today. I texted him when I was in London, and no matter where he is in the world, he gets back to me in 5 minutes. I mean, think about it. This is like India's most important composer, but the connection is there, right? In the same way, I developed a connection with Timbaland because he had so invested himself in Indian music 10 years before he even met me, that when he and I met in the spirit of taking advantage of this technical skill that I had, we had a connection. When I started my movie career, my movie producing career, once again, it was because I was a Bollywood singer. I had Bollywood access through all these things I was doing. It quickly put me in a room with big writers, like not just writers who wrote one screenplay, writers who wrote 8 screenplays that made it to blockbuster status in India, right? Actors who not only did 3 movies, actors who did 40 movies that reach. So as soon as you get into the room, my process was, how'd you do that? Okay, so what happened? So how did you guys work this thing and work that thing? And what were the things? You just start becoming your own AI engine on the creative process. I would oftentimes come back from meetings I have with these big celebrities who maybe we'll have some of them join one day. Just write down, okay, what are all the bad things that happened? You know, where did they go on? And so by the time you sit down and do it, you are gathering from different knowledge and different people that you've talked to. And the reason I want to be thoughtful about saying this is that not everybody has that sort of access that I did. But people, what people do have now is they have YouTube videos. They have the ability to talk to people like me and all my colleagues and learn that way. So whatever process you're going to do, don't do it by yourself. There is a lot of resource out there and people who are willing to say, I really screwed that one up. And listen to those, because we can have probably 8 podcasts about how I screwed up the Buddha process before I even started it. So I can, there's a reason why it took as long as it did. And there's a reason why it took me 5 years to say, I want to do it now, So lack of access shouldn't be a discouraging factor. But in my case, I had a tremendous amount of access to screenwriters, to musicians, to people that showed me, here is exactly what happens in a good process, and here's what happens in a bad process.
Wow, that's inspiring. So I have one, and there's a lot of considerations that I could take out of this, because of course, you're talking about some of the biggest personalities of music and creators in the planet in the last 20, 30, 50 years in some cases, but or more. What is interesting here, let me ask one question. We talk about music as a process of dealing, and for me, it's actually one of the things that helps me a lot deal with well-being and as well with my personal balance, because I like you, I never came out as a musician recently, at least since my teenager years. Yeah. But I started my career with music and literature. And one of the things that is interesting is, and I want to ask you that is, especially for me as a creator, when I start writing a lot, or I start getting even in research, because I love research, and it might be even technology research, or in this case, more creative research. One of the things that happens that affects, well, I don't smoke and drink, so it doesn't affect my lifestyle, is not so bad, but it kind of, you cannot stop. And I think that is, it's one of the things I want to ask. And I think for people listening to us, this is particularly important, because as a creator, there's sometimes an obsession about something, and you go and you follow that obsession, but then that can actually create a problem with your family, with your loved ones, because you are so. And I have this case, for instance, I had the case of, even I have a lot of very high profile friends that are top global writers. And I know that they, for instance, some of them are like from 6 a.m. to this time, they really go into a place and they cut things with everyone else. And there are other people that can continue a good balanced life. And there are other writers and creators that self-destroy themselves because they cannot deal with the pressure. And as well, there's a pressure of creating something better. But there's as well your kind of background, your failures. So I would like to see how you deal with that, because this is a big thing in music, but as well in life.
It is so hard. God, I mean, it's a painful topic, because when I do, like yesterday, it happened to me. When I was back scoring, because I'm really actively scoring this book now, right? I keep going back to Dara's theme. Da 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 da. That's the tree theme. So now I've forgotten Dara's theme, but I went back to the three theme. Da 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 da. So I laid down the piano tracks 2 days ago, and the amount of agony that I went through myself on the velocity of each note, each and every note, the velocity factor in Logic, I just couldn't stop. I couldn't stop, and it just became so delightful and so agonizing at the same time. And meanwhile, my mother, as you know, is dying. She's in the nursing home with glioblastoma. So I'm shuttling back and forth by just trying to get some food in her. So I have a few more days with her, then going back, because meanwhile, I'm obsessed with Dara's theme. Going back, da 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 da. Just keep going back. Finally, I got to a point where I'm like, okay, it's 6 o'clock and I've gotten nothing done on this, how I see this theme unfolding before I start the narration. 6 o'clock. Now I'm really in it. I'm like, it's finally sounding good. And you know, in my Logic thing, and I got the piano and this and that, and the piano, I go with the piano back here and I redo the theme. Then I get the call at 7:30 from my husband. What's for dinner? I'm like, what? I've taken care of everybody else all day. And then he's like, well, the baby, you know, our high school boy is like, he's hungry. What's for dinner? I'm like, so finally I thought, okay, what would Buddha have done at this moment? Because this is what I wanted to say to him. You figure out dinner. I'm going to stay here for the next 4 hours. I'm going to get this theme done, you know? But then I thought, okay, so Buddha's teachings are, and I would encourage every writer to listen to Buddha. Buddha's teachings are, whatever action you're going to take now, there's a consequence. So not having dinner with your family at 7:40 p.m., which is a logical time to have dinner with your family. I would say it's even on the border of late. Not having dinner with your family, and you still have a boy in your home who needs a mom, has a consequence. Whatever that consequence may be, you may see it a year from now or 5 years from now, but it will certainly come back to you in this karmic way. Is there a consequence with me not finishing what is in my mind, in my head? Yeah, I'll probably have a worse piece of art. I probably won't get it out the way it is. This piece of art is here for me at this moment right now. I probably won't get it back, but here's my choice. Do I want a good family? Do I want to be able to hold my husband's hand until the day I'm in my mom's situation, with love and kindness in the nursing home and with nurses and her family? I rather choose that outcome than the outcome of this great theme, right? It's just measuring, it's constantly, every minute of the day, constantly being aware of the outcomes, whether you take this path or that path. And I realized I got to stop. I just got to stop. And, I know now when I go back at 11 a.m. to that theme, it's probably not going to be the same. But I've already sort of made my choice.
It's about choices, and it's about life is about choices as well.
I'd
So
rather choose the connection with my husband.
no, it's of course much more precious. But as a creator, I understand you get lost in your own creativity, and this is actually a very big risk as well. I wanna go from here to the day process of our own lifestyles. We touched in last episode with Suvarna about the challenge with technology and the distractions. And I was actually, I've been reading a lot. Actually, yesterday I wrote something about these things, and I want to go through some of the thoughts, and I want to interact with you and do this in the light of Buddha, because you have the research for that as well.
Right.
So the research is, I will use 2 quotes, okay? And this is quite a complex one, but I know that you are a super mind, so I'm not worried. So the first one is a quote from Ray Kurzweil, as you know, one of the biggest. Actually, we're going probably to interview him, or at least actually I interview someone from his team. When you talk to a human in 2035, you'll be talking to someone that is a combination of biological and non-biological intelligence. So this is Ray Kurzweil, that is one of the biggest AI researchers and former scientific director of Google and so forth. I want to go back to this, but the other one is mine, and is a kind of a reflection that I've been thinking more and more. Is that it's based in another quote from Ray Kurzweil, that is, if you think linear, you can walk 30 miles or 30 steps, and you get to 30 steps. But if you think exponential, you can go to 1 billion. And I'm picking on the 2 things I thought about this thought, is that our intuition is caused by some kind of linear organic thinking. But when we go to right now, all of us, we have to integrate some kind of well-being, technology, exponential way of thinking, or wellness in some ways. So how do you see these topics? I know that is quite a big question, but I think because you're creating music, you're writing with technology, we are interviewing each other thanks to technology, and these are the positive things. But then there's a lot of other things that we have. But this is right now coming to our lives, and I think I would like to see this from the angle of Buddha and your research.
Well, technology could be a great, but I think the main thing that I gathered from my research on Buddha is the importance you place on the notion is what is really happening, right? What is actually going on? And it's thinking deeper about that. We live, the human mind is a storytelling machine. We do know that, right? From the early, we know that Israel was a myth factory. LA now is a myth factory. We know that, we know people have been in the profession of religion, myth, fantasy creation since the dawn of the human mind, right? What people tend to do is, from what I've seen in particularly among creatives, is in our society there's no religion, right? There's no one overarching kind of circle that people say, okay, my thought, it goes into this circle and all makes sense. Religion was probably very good in that. But what I'm seeing a lot of people do right now is create fantasy bubbles.
Yes.
And that is a weird thing to watch happen with people. And that happens with me, is I have this fantasy. I'm going to be the best designer in the world. I have this fantasy. I'm going to tell people I'm going to be an expert on well-being. I have this fantasy. I'm going to be a internet billionaire. I have this fantasy. I'm going to have a six-pack abs. I have this fantasy. I'm going to have to be able to travel the world. Another fantasy. I'm going to have the most exquisite, group of friends so all these, now what I'm seeing people have is they don't have one overarching idea, but they have a lot of ideas, and the ideas are coalesced enough where they become bubbles, but they're fantasy bubbles that exist like polka dots. So I see a lot of people today, particularly in the creative community, and even a lot of executives that have fantasy polka dots, this fantasy, that fantasy, this story, this, and they're like, in a way, just going after it, like all these different things at the same time. And the sense of reality is completely lost. Now, here's where technology can be the best aid ever. You have all these fantasy bubbles, polka dots all over. I mean, there's so many polka dots that, you know, it's like you could just see it floating around over people's heads. Where technology, I think, could be extremely valuable is let's figure out what's really happening. Okay, one polka dot you may have. Let's do some research. Let's connect with people. Let's use technology to either make that polka dot bigger into something real or shrink it and get rid of it. Because the truth of any human experience is that you can focus on a few things. And if you focus on a few things, you'll be really good. Okay. But part of it is the elimination of the polka dots. And
I love
technology
this.
is a fantastic way to eliminate polka dots. However, and this is where you can help me, because I don't know as much. Technology can also be the creation of a lot more polka dots.
Yes, at the moment it's what it is.
And that's a big problem, is that every time you go online and you have a post, it just, the harm it can do to you from the standpoint of it creates a new fantasy polka dot that is not grounded in what's really happening, the way Buddha advocated for people to say, this is really happening. You know, it can potentially create a lot of noise. That's my philosophy on the use of technology, is how I can actually figure out a way to shrink and become an expert and then expand.
Yeah, I like, first of all, the fantasy bubbles that you mentioned, and there's the polka dots, because it's true. But I think let's come back to Buddha on this, because I'm particularly interested. Of course, I've been talking about for the last 1 year in technology. So let's talk right now about Buddha on the sense of more in depth of this. If you look at history, and I've been thinking about this, of course, you did a lot of research for Buddha, and you went actually for another time zone for a couple of years, because you have to go to that time zone to understand what is going on and understand that. So you start living that time zone, you have to imagine all these different things. So one of my questions for you is, because if you look at history, we always, so coming back to the fantasy bubbles and the polka dots, every civilization in history created its own narrative. Mm-hmm. And most of these narratives are autocratics or divine driven, or deification of different concepts and stories around that.
Deities are fantasy bubbles.
Yes, exactly. But the difference is that at the moment, and this is kind of the thing that I want to look at is in the light of Buddha, because Buddha was about enjoying the moment and as well understanding how to create a balance with yourself and the world around you. And I think that's the biggest challenge of the 21st century, is that we have, of course, all these fantastic polka dot capacities, but we are using it, to be honest, as a civilization, we're using it very well. I think there's a lot of probably too much negativity around the use of technology, because in general, the technology is actually helping everyone. And we have 7 billion people in the planet because of technology. Let's put it that way. It's more and more because of that. Because otherwise, if you look just in the beginning of the 20th century, there was 1 billion people. Mm-hmm. So that means we 7 times multiply everything that we're talking here. So on the light of this, is how do you see, even making the parallel between the time of Buddha and the time now, on this kind of balance between this kind of fantasy bubbles, but as well the polka dots, and as well the balance that is necessary to keep this?
Well, there's fantasy bubbles, right? And I think Buddha lived in a time of a lot of fantasy bubbles, because Hinduism was, coalescing. So there was the concept of stratification of society. There was the concept of gods. There was a concept of what a family unit should be in an agrarian society. So they had good constructions and fantasy bubbles. But polka dots started coming to him because he started seeing other humans when he got out. It became polka dots, which is when we engage in technology, we see more polka dots. Oh, Kim Kardashian did this. Oh, Priyanka Chopra did this. And Look at how J-Lo handles. It's polka dots start forming. There's a point where it becomes noise. There's so many polka dots, it becomes noise. And then finally, in its final form, it becomes cacophony, right? It's just complete anarchic information. We have to figure out, and I think AI has the potential to take anarchic information, which has gone from fantasy bubbles to polka dots to noise to anarchy, and take it back and synthesize it and say, okay, here's what's important. The problem is, who's going to tell you what's important? And what's the barometer in which the AI engine is going to tell you what's important? Is it important to just keep human life alive? Is it important to go from 1 billion to 7 billion people to 15 billion people? Is that important? Or is there a way to judge when you're trying to synthesize cacophony? Is there a way to judge, okay, so what is the quality of someone's life? Is the quality of life measured in the form of being able to eat, or is the quality of life measured in the form of not being jealous of somebody else? To me, if not, the idea of not being jealous of somebody else and the idea of not and being happy for somebody else directly impacts my quality of life. I can tell you that now that with absolute certainty, that when I feel good about somebody else, I feel the direct impact of the quality of my life, the increase in the quality of my life. How is an AI engine going to say, well, all this information is going to synthesize so Amrita feels positive feelings as a cheerleader for somebody else? I don't know. I mean, but I do think that when it comes down to the teachings of Buddha, it's so profound in its application today, is the notion that you have the potential in your life to completely get just consumed by noise and consumed by anarchic thoughts. And there has to be a human technology in your mind. There is a mechanism of your brain that you can trigger, almost like a chemical switch, to say, noise, go away. Let's synthesize. Whatever it is, it's your own AI engine. Let's figure out what the heck is happening, right? I keep going back to it. Even in everything we do, like whether we pursue something or not, let's base it on some sort of attempt. Not I'm just saying knowledge, attempt at figuring out what is happening. What are the odds that this is going to be a big fantasy bubble that can have a positive impact on the world, or just becomes part of a noise? You and I are going through it right now. Think about it. We're engaged in this beautiful activity, right? It's one of our fantasy bubbles. It has the potential to have a very positive impact on a lot of people, or it could become part of another piece of a polka dot in the algorithmic chain. We don't really know, but I think the teachings of Buddha actually allow you to say, all right, well, likely, not likely. Maybe, probable, not probable. Those are very important things.
No,
Buddha is the original. If you think now, let's think about this. Was Buddha the original AI engine? Next topic.
I love it.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Actually, that is a topic in itself. I think we should do this. Actually, I have to. I was supposed to meet is a friend of mine that is one of the biggest AI experts in the world, and it would be because he comes from an healthcare background. Let's get him here.
It's our tag. Was Buddha the original AI engine?
I love that. I think we should do that. No, and I think actually using that topic. Imagine if you program an entire AI based on Buddha. I think that's a fantastic one. And actually, you should add into your narrative, into your book, probably as a new Alex. Yeah.
There's so many brilliant rules, like don't be jealous of somebody else, right? And think about just eliminating jealousy, how much your increase in quality of life will be. What a profound impact that will have.
Yeah, it's about getting rid of ego as well. It's one of the biggest things and most complicated ones. But when you do that, it really works very well, because when you get rid of ego, you can actually, you don't really need to plan to try to go in that direction of trying to please anyone. You can just focus and really do great stuff. So let's go back to the idea of Buddha in the sense of not on the AI. I think that it will be a new episode, although we have a lot of great pearls coming out of this one. I'm interested coming back to the idea of the fantasy bubble, because the thing is that if you look at fantasy bubble, is that you have how can I put it in that way? It's that we have a huge amount of so in the end of the day, most of the I would say from philosophers to thinkers to religious people is all about creating a dimension of perception. Okay, and our perception, our pain, of course, there's physical pain and different things. Even Elon Musk is talking about some kind of the virtual realities, the metaverse right now, that is very powerful right now in technology and in everything related with gaming and so forth. But in this kind of fantasy bubble and the perception, how do you see that? Because in the end of the day, if you I think the main challenge of this concept and this kind of not just concept, this subject, is that it can make you a cynic, and it can actually destroy all your concept of understanding reality. And I think I want to touch this because I think this is for me a big thing, and especially for teenagers and children, because even I see with my daughter, if she's only 8 years old, but if I let her stay for a couple of hours in front of devices, which is always terrible, she becomes like a zombie. And this is happening to us as well as humans, because that's the fact. Yeah.
The zombification of a human is the fantasy bubble, the polka dots, the noise, the cacophony. And your result is the zombification of a human mind. Right? We have to get our kids out of the cacophony, out of that cycle.
Yeah, it's a big thing. But at the same time, this is kind of, let's look at history. And you were 5 years researching the time history of Buddha. The challenge is that at the time, people would be as well on the bubble of going to the church or going to the temple. They would be as well on the bubble of having to. People spend like 3 hours on the church repeating one formula or one prayer.
Yeah.
So it's not very different. The thing right now is that you do that in front of devices, interacting or with programs of software, and the software is right now interacting with us as well. So there's already some kind of cyber. But in terms of what this is mostly about, what makes us humans. I think that's where we're coming here. But let's bring a bit more of complex. Let's bring music here. And you are the musician here with high profile. How do you bring music here to this equation? Let's use that.
All right. So music has a very music now is technology. Technology and music are very closely linked. They're almost inseparable, right? Because if you're a really good piano player and you can't get the thing mic'd and into a good digital system, it'll never be recorded, right? So there's a lot of good and bad in the technology music process. One is that it does allow you the ability to concentrate on the here and now. Here's the note, here's the thing, here's the piece of art. It has this unique ability to shut away all the bad stuff in your life because you're focusing on the good. The problem, though, is that there's so much sound and so much stuff. Like, as an example, when I use plugins on Logic or Pro Tools, I have access to native instruments, to Omnisphere, to addictive drums, to Logic's own thing, to Alchemy, to now I just started using this thing called Swam, which is breath control software. So I have all these pieces of software, and you're like, oh, and Roland Cloud, and this and that and this. All of a sudden, my fantasy bubble of creating this beautiful like piece of Dara song is now, it's going to sound like this monster of R&B meets techno dance meets hip hop meets Dara song, you know. So the same thing happens lightning fast where it goes into cacophony. What you could do as a musician, right, is you can, because so much technology and layers of tracks are available to you, one way is shrink it down to 3 tracks, 3 instruments. And really big musicians have told me to do it. 3 instruments, your piano, your voice, your strings. Okay. Add the drums later, all of it. If it doesn't appeal to a common person with those 3 instruments, then it's probably better to move on to another fantasy bubble. And a fantasy bubble I will describe as a song. Okay. Because if the root of that fantasy bubble, if the actual shrinked constructive root is not in that, living inside that fantasy bubble in the form of a really good melody or an idea, it's probably better not to keep putting more garbage on that thing. Let's move on, because there's no way around the fantasy bubble. Everybody has to live inside of a fantasy bubble. That's humanity. But let's figure out if that fantasy bubble has something inside of it, right? And if it's not getting a reaction, then just move on. That's another reason why I remember when Kanye West was telling me, because I represented him almost 10 years ago, he was telling me when Jay-Z and he built their album together, they had a whiteboard, lots of songs. But what was getting the reaction of that whiteboard? You don't know. You're going to pick your fantasy bubbles to construct the album, but you don't really know. And you have to have the discipline, like Buddha would have said, is move on from the fantasy bubble, because if it's not tied to your breath, it's probably not going to happen. It's the same ideas being recycled over and over and over again. I could give you an example of how you do that in art. And when I construct, like one of my pillows is here, right? I can give you an exact parallel to how I threw out all the garbage on that piece of art and focused on one fantasy bubble at a time.
Wow. Well, I think this is opening so much metaverses of fantasy, but I would put as well probably this more about and I think wrapping up, because I think we passed 1 hour or something. But I think what is interesting is if you look at another definition of fantasy bubble is as well your personal space, or your kind of your music for, because I think coming back to I always like to go to some old quotes, but if you look at especially, there's one from Lao Tzu that is very beautiful, that is, music in the soul can be heard by the universe. So if you look at okay, if you, first of all, in order for you to visualize the universe, you need to get out of your bubble. So you need to get out of your fantasy, and you need to think there's something more than just you. But I think if you look at this narrative integrated in some kind of tonality, and there's an orchestra, there's some kind of music on that. So I think it's kind of we touched fantastic things today. Actually, I love the idea of the Buddha artificial intelligence. I think we're going to be definitely bringing probably Ben Gorsel or
next topic, your album, right? I have a series of 12 fantasy bubbles. Song 1, song 2, all the way to song 12. They're fantasy bubbles. Each great fantasy bubbles, right? With its own idea, its own motifs, all that kind of stuff. Imagine where that fantasy bubble, then you start finding the connective tissue between those fantasy bubbles, which great religions have done, like Hinduism has taken all these different fantasy bubbles and they've sort of shaped it into a sphere, right? Imagine an album taking all these 12 or 13 fantasy bubbles and it becomes an idea. It becomes literally something that has the ability to communicate to strangers. The same idea has the power to communicate to someone sitting in Mongolia as it does in East LA. Do you know that hip hop is one of the most consumed, like Mongolian hip hop is one of the most consumed forms of music in what was previously that whole Buddha territory, Mongolian hip hop. Think about the idea of hip hop. The idea is so powerful, so big. And all those people that were involved in creating that beautiful sphere of a fantasy bubble, how it now just bounced over to Mongolia. That's the power of a good fantasy bubble. So I challenge AI to do that. Because if it's man against AI, there's more proof that man was able to take hip hop and bounce it over to Mongolia. I want to see AI do the same thing. And I'm fine with it. Let's take it on.
I think it will be definitely our next episode will be about that probably, although we have a couple of guests. But I'm thinking about this. This is amazing, and it's a great way to wrap up. Thank you for listening to us. This has been actually for me would be fantastic. I think we did poetry, art, technology, and literature here, and we had a bit of singing from Amrita. Hopefully, she will play piano for us next time.
Come around so much, Dinis. We're awful.
No. It's very special. Thank you. I'm very grateful for this special moment and looking forward for next week at the same time. Thank you.
See you later.